reality. There was no pandemic. It didn't happen. Nothing happened.
The coronavirus is the biggest threat this country has faced for decades.
Today I am officially declaring a national emergency.
In your view, did COVID exist?
I would tend to believe no. The plan seemed to be to create this fear, this mass hysteria, in order to get people to accept a vaccination. And we saw that whenever the vaccine rollout began, where it was, you're going to kill your granny. They told innocent, beautiful children that they couldn't see their grannies, or they were going to kill them. This is about getting us a digital ID.
Well, we can't be censored. Warren Scully, don't go down.
Welcome back, guys, to the Bear Podcast Show with me, Sean Scullion, aka The Handsome Stranger, Owen Mallon, aka The Bear, Aidan, the face for radio behind the scenes, and today we are joined by Dr. Anne McCluskey. And welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here.
Thank you so much for coming up. First, before we get in, and I'm sure we will get into a lot of detail, how about we just go through who is Dr. Anne? How did this all start, and how did you get into medicine, and take us from the very start. Where was the wild days in uni, and where did you born at?
Yeah, I probably wouldn't want to tell you it all. Yeah, my name's Anne McCluskey. I was born and reared in Derry, and I went to school at Thornhill College, and then I actually wanted, you see, to do biochemistry, but I also wanted to go to Dublin to study. And in those days, this now as I'm talking about, I went to university in 1975. I did science and English A-levels, and I kind of really didn't know what I wanted to do. So to go to do biochemistry in Dublin took 4 years. And in England, I got accepted for universities in England. I nearly went to Imperial College for my sins. But there it was 3 years. So I thought, what the hell, I'll do medicine. So that actually is how I ended up doing medicine. And I had 5 lovely, just brilliant years as a student in Dublin. It was great because in those days you didn't require much of a science qualifications in order to get to do medicine. So I kind of was a bit of a know-it-all for the first couple of years because the others were from a standing start doing biochemistry and physics and those things for the first. And pints were 23p in the bar.
Bring back those days.
Definitely showing my age now. 23p. Yeah, exactly. 23p. And then I got a grant. My father we weren't particularly well off. So then by the time you changed that, in them days it was the punts.
That's right.
So by the time you changed your sterling into punts, there was plenty of beer money. So I'm actually joking. I actually didn't drink until I was in my mid-20s. But do you know what I mean? It was great. It was great, and I loved it. And I loved my job. And again, how I ended up back in the north, I was going to work in Dublin, and I always kind of thought I'd stay in hospital medicine. But my friend had just got married, and this is privileged information again. And in those days, there wasn't jobs for everybody in Dublin, so people had to go out the country, and they worked in Navan, and some of them had to go further afield. So what I did was I got a job in the Mater Hospital, in the teaching hospital. But my parents were, I suppose, getting on a bit, and I just kind of always, I'm a Derry girl, I wanted home. So I held on to the job at the last minute, and then my friend who didn't get a job in Dublin and who was pregnant at the time got the job that I was supposed to get. So it was a wee bit of a sneaky one. So yeah, that was it. And then I came back to Altnagalvin, worked there, did what was called in those days houseman year there. And then I just got interested I did medicine, and I got interested then in children's medicine. So I moved to Belfast and did a couple of years training in paediatrics there. The plan being I was going to be a paediatrician. And, I loved it. But kind of, at the time then, I'd met he indoors, and I kind of wanted to make my own little paediatric problem, so I kind of gave up on hospital medicine because it was full on. Like in those days, it was 1 night and 4, and in the Royal Belfast Hospital for Sick Children, And in the Royal Maternity Hospital, I worked for a year in the perinatal intensive care unit. And you went into work at 9 in the morning, and if it was your night on call, you didn't get out. In fact, you didn't sit down until 6 o'clock the following afternoon. You know, it was literally, you know, almost 48 hours. And you maybe, again, had 3 or 4 very premature children, sometimes twins, you know, born at 4 in the morning at 26 weeks or something. And, you know, that all of that was going on. And again, you know, there wasn't the consultant support that there was now. We had to take arterial blood and put it into a machine. And, you know, now it's all indwelling, you know, intra-arterial catheters and that. And do an exchange transfusions for children that were jaundiced. But it was brilliant. I loved it. In fact, one Christmas dinner, they had the Christmas dinner in the hospital, and I went up at about 11 o'clock to see all my babies, you know, and you really got very involved with the care of those children, and it was great to see them going home. And then we had a party once a year for children, particularly who'd been there for a while. You know, the sickest ones, and they'd be come back, you know, age 3, 4, 5, and it was just it was wonderful. And it was there that I first really, I suppose, honed my very pro-life views. The understanding that these wee scraps of humanity wanted to live. They were fighting for their lives, and they hated us because we were always sticking needles in them and poking them and suctioning them, and you know, they felt pain, and they, you know, they even had their own personalities. There were placid ones and angry, you know, and some of them actually looked like their parents, even, you know, 8, 9 weeks, 10 weeks before they were due to be born. So that was, and I suppose since then I've been active in the pro-life movement, and I suppose also then that brings you into areas of politics too. So, I came back then to Derry and worked in community paediatrics for a while in, as I used to be called a clinical medical officer, community paediatrician, so that's the interface between health and medicine, so that, for example, children who had physical or sensory problems, it was trying to get them medically as good as they could be and liaison with the school to give them the best outcomes in terms of health and education. And I loved that was good as well. And it was at that time I had 4 children, so I had young babies at the time, so it kind of worked. And then later on, I was offered a partnership in a local practice, and I always thought that being a GP, it was more holistic. I suppose you're seeing a wider variety of stuff. So I worked as a partner in Chantala Health Centre for 30 years. There were 3 of us in the practice, Vincent, Eileen and myself. And I have to say it was a joy to go into work. We got on, the 3 partners got on so well. We worked hard, we worked our asses off. But everybody worked, you know, and there was no such thing as a division of labour. It was just everybody did what needed to be done, what was there. And we had 6 or 7 receptionists, and again we had almost no staff turnover. The girls went off if they were pregnant, but we had the same pool of girls that were even there before I joined, and it was like a big family. And we had about 4,000 patients in a Pittsville 1960s poured concrete, totally unsuitable health centre in an area with one of the highest socioeconomic deprivation indexes in these islands and probably in the whole of Europe. 60% child poverty, huge unemployment levels, a lot of the social issues that plague modern society. But it was brilliant. I went into work whistling every morning, and I'm not saying I would have wanted to stay there after my days was over, but it was a great privilege, and I do miss it. You know, I do miss it. So then the time came to retire, and I thought, for me, since I'd been interested in politics, I come from, I suppose, a Republican background, but I was very concerned about the movement, the communism and the anti-life, the destructive, as I saw it, agenda which was infiltrating all of that. And interestingly, we'll maybe get on to that. So anyway, I stood as an independent in 2016 under the banner, "The party's over," because party politics, we can see it doesn't work. It's just an illusion where people vote thinking that something might change, and people are supposed left, right. All of this is nonsense, because there's only them and us, really. The only division in society is up and down, and all of it is controlled. So I stood as an independent, and we had a great campaign, and I came within, I think, about 100 votes of getting elected as an MLA. Eamon McCann, I think it was his third or fourth go, beat me by a very narrow margin. Do you know why? I actually didn't begrudge it, because I don't agree with a single word Eamon says, but I'm quite fond of him. And to be fair, he's been consistent in his.
He's never changed, has he?
He never has, But I remember the stuff that he was writing during the conflict here, and some of it was downright nasty. But he actually is sort of retired from politics now.
Before we go too far on, there's a few things there, and we've touched on some issues, and we'll get into some issues, and some are highly charged issues. So we'll navigate the waters. But going back, just to hearing what you said about the working in the hospital, if that was any other profession, like, it's illegal. It's illegal, first and foremost, to work that many hours. If this was any other profession, people would be going mad that it. But also, the high stakes, when I say the high stakes, when doctors make mistakes, which is everyone can make a mistake.
Sure. When
a doctor makes a mistake, it's not a small thing, and then it becomes everyone. If you make a mistake at that level, and a child or something like that, there comes the tribunals, comes with it.
Yeah.
Has there not been the point where people are like, these people are sleep deprived, overworked? How are you operating and making such hugely the decisions that doctors have to make, especially if you're saying they're 26 weeks and it's a very small margin of time and error to administer the right drug or whatever the course of treatment has so much profound effect. How is that okay? To me, that sounds absolutely bonkers.
It was never okay. But you just did it because that's the way it was. I mean, I've seen me the next day looking at notes that I've written during the night, and I didn't remember doing them. Or you were in an altered state of consciousness, But one of the senior consultants there, it was funny. There was a bit of money going about for improvement to the doctor's accommodation, and somebody asked him, "Oh, what should we spend? What should we do, to the doctor's accommodation to make it a bit better?" And he said, "Take the bed out." And it's true, because the bed was only a temptation. We just assumed you weren't getting into it. My then boyfriend, boyfriend, used to come and stay at night and bring me a Chinese at about 4 a.m. Because there wasn't even a canteen. So he slept. I worked. It was insane. But every a lot of it was the same. I think perinatal pediatrics is very intensive, because it is you are having to be the lungs and kidneys of these wee mites, because their own lungs and kidneys are too immature. So you're having to do the breathing for them via a ventilator, and look at their bloods and intravenous fluids and feeding. So all of that had to be monitored artificially until such times as their own systems became mature enough.
Has that sort of psyche, that cycle, changed, or is that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Years ago they brought in these European directives, and that so that doctors cannot, in law, work those types of shifts anymore. At consultant level, obviously you can work longer, but the junior doctors do have, more say in hours. But seriously, at the weekends, I did a couple of locum registrar weekends in Alton Galvin, and again, you started at 6 o'clock on a Friday after having worked your day job, and you were on call until 9 o'clock on Monday morning. That's 72 hours. Is it? Yeah. 3 days. And you were, no, there were times it was quiet, but they were rare. Other specialties were less full on. But particularly neonatal intensive care was pretty.
Is pediatrics a vocational style call where it was hard work, but the reward, like we kids, like
yeah, I would like to think so. I would like to think all medicine is a vocation, in terms of it, because we take. And this is something that is very relevant to stuff that we'll probably be talking about later on. We take unqualifying, we take an oath. And the oath is, there is no Hippocratic oath text, but it varies and people can tailor it. But at UCD in 1981, the graduation day was my birthday. And we swore, we took a solemn oath. And it is about first do no harm, your duty of care to your patients. And in those days it was, you shall not procure abortion. I took that oath and I've honoured it. And there's basic principles.
Just so we can clarify before we go on, because we will discuss this. It was in it that tax was in the oath in UCD when you took it.
It was optional at that time, and some of a tiny minority of my classmates chose to leave that bit out. But it was, right, okay. It is. But generally speaking, the broad construct is that your duty is to do no harm and care for people. And then the sort of the advice, the sort of guidelines for the profession. There's good medical practice. There's informed consent and decision-making consent. Those things then lay out in more detail the stuff that is required of us. And it is about treating people as you would like to be treated. It's about their dignity. It's about their ability to consent, their requirement to have informed consent. And there's, and then just general stuff about the autonomy, bodily sovereignty, that the patient is a partner, and it's to stop that kind of paternalism or.
As the world's changed, and I know when you would have been doing that, an oath was you took your oath, and your oath was your word, and that was people's profession, and that's how it had been judged. Mm-hmm. As the world's changed now, it's become more illegal, that. And we all know it. We know in teaching or in doctors or in most walks of life now, it's the paperwork outweighs the work. Yeah. It's the watching your back, the making sure. And I'm sorry to say that, it's the watching your back, but you know what I mean? It's making sure you've dotted the I's and crossed the T's, that legally you've done it right. So that's why I just want to clarify that when you're saying the oath, and now it's become a more...
An oath's always optional, but you're absolutely right. I mean, most people now would maybe not take it, or it wasn't required, but most doctors are happy that to be guided by those types of principles. But I mean, during I'm an old lady now. During my long medical career, I have seen medicine change absolutely. At the NHS, I mean, way back in the day. Whenever I worked in out in the Galvin and in Belfast, the consultant was in charge of the ward. Well, he thought he was in charge of the ward. It was actually the ward sister who ran the ward.
It's always been the way.
but these women were brilliant. Some of them had 30 years experience. We were coming in thinking we knew everything, after 6 months or even on your first day. The first thing, certainly as a junior doctor, you do is make friends with the ward sister. And make sure that she knows that you don't mind her telling you what to do, I remember one time giving blood to somebody and says, well, I run it in over an hour, and she says, she'll kill him. Just nicely and quietly. And I said, what do you reckon, 2 hours? 4. She'd done this 100 times. You test, But so that the wards were run in that way. Whenever you got sick from something, the consultant that saw you in for that was kind of your doctor for the rest of your days. They were that was the doctor. They were your consultant, and there was much less of this super specialism where now somebody goes and looks at your kidneys. But if you say, by the way, of this dreadful rash, you can't do that. There's no holism anymore. It's these super specialties, and it's become very fragmented. And I think that's a big loss for patients. Now, I'm not saying, of course, if you need a liver transplant, I want it to be done by somebody who's doing these things regularly. But I think it's gone too far in terms of, that people aren't seen as, you're seen as your disease rather than as the person that you are. The other thing that happened is this, the new contract under Tony Blair, which I voted against and campaigned against, whereby GPs were paid for, it was item of service, but it was worse than that. It was about meeting targets. So that we started then, and even when you resisted it and knew it was wrong, you kind of had to do it so that you were, for example, and it meant that you were prescribing more, so that if somebody, for example, had diabetes, you had less freedom to look at their lifestyle, look at their needs, look at what they needed. And it was all about getting their blood parameters below these levels, getting their cholesterol at this level, went up on the drugs. And so that people with some of these chronic illnesses were taking, astronomical amounts of medication. And as we know, the biggest killer in modern medicine is adverse drug reactions. So that you spend a lot of your time trying to get people off stuff, but there was very little emphasis on lifestyle, on alternative medicine. But then, of course, that, we know that the whole medical education was taken over by these tax-exempt foundations who were linked. And this is the fruits of this are very much coming to the fore from what we've seen over the last few years. So, for example, the Rockefeller Foundation, they use the word philanthropic, which means they don't pay taxes and they pay for their political agendas, essentially. They more or less took over medical education and closed out the alternative, free, plant-based homeopathy, these things that were helping people. And everything became function of pharmaceuticals, made from the waste products of the oil industry that they owned. It's a good business plan, yeah.
So the people that peddled the drugs educated the medical staff to supply.
Yes.
To create.
And again, I am old enough that I have to say, maybe it did happen to some extent, but the first professor in University College Dublin was AstraZeneca, was sponsored. That was the first, and it was sort of like the talking point, that imagine a drug company. He's not a real professor. He's sponsored by a drug company, and that was unheard of. And I have to say, it was like the olden time. We had a crowd of old sort of professors and consultants who were. I remember the consultant neurologist. His lectures were like a stage show. He could take off all the various neurological diseases. He could do Parkinson's. He could do, it was just stuff that you'll never forget. But there was very little. Pharmacology was in there, but it was a small part of the programme. But by the time even I got to do postgraduate exams, only maybe 4 or 5 years later, pharmacology was getting more to the forefront. And certainly over the course of my professional lifetime, you can see the change from, treating holistically to targets, drugs, and very algorithms, very rote learning, drop-down menus, so that there's much less. And a medicine, I believe, is an art. It's obviously a skill. You have to know what you're doing, but there is. I really believe in personalised care, and as a GP, it was great because you knew people. As I say, particularly as you get on and a bit, you've been there a while. You know the mammies, you know the grannies, you know the children, and you get to the stage then where you're kind of seeing the children having their babies, and it's time to retire. But it was great, and the woman of a family, you'd know the granny, but the women all go and marry men with different names, and it's maybe only after 10 years ago, I know who you are, your son, so that and there's massive extended families, and I think having that. It was good for people. The other thing in the olden days, is that in the health centre, our receptionists, very often they ran, they have these things now where people phone up in the mornings and make sure they're okay. They more or less did that. We had people who just rang in for a chat, and the girls would have chatted to them. And maybe that was the only person they would speak to all that day, maybe even all that week.
We've had a couple of run-ins where
you more than me, Ewan.
We took into them one show where somebody says to me one time, it was about if border control was ever lacking jobs that could give them to receptionists, because you can't get past the doctor's receptionist at the best of times. But I understand to a degree now. We're just especially to what we're describing. Like we were talking there in different parts and seeing different parts of a service now. If something you were saying, if something was wrong, you would go to a dermatologist, or they start splitting it up and becoming disjointed. But an overstretched system and seeing different departments in it, you will have that disconnection, and you'll have that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing, and not an informed decision being made on one person. And we can see it more and more now. Private, everything seems to go the American way. The private insurance now, the private healthcare, and
the NHS. People, it's not a free service. People pay for their taxes, through their taxes for it. People are entitled to care, and certainly in the course of my professional career, I saw elderly people who were in the NHS. The numbers of beds and units that were closed that I could see, the profitable parts were privatised, and the Cinderella services like geriatrics and the care of the elderly and those things were just they just were run down, and then a lot of what would have been, again in the olden days we had residential homes that were NHS run, and then that was all privatised. And I'm not saying, a lot of the private nursing homes are excellent, but it's a change in emphasis. There's
obviously a conflict with you as the medical world's changed, and like a political conflict in having to make a stand for some of the beliefs that you have. And then there's come a point, obviously, you've been forced to decide what you're doing. But obviously, we're going to move on here now and talk. We've got a good understanding of your medical, your passion for it. But then this obviously then led till when the COVID-19 pandemic, as people all know now, and people will start making their views. And it'll be weird now. It'll be weird how we're judged in time when we look back on this. But I wanted to ask more along the lines of, obviously then you got a lot of conflict, not conflict, but you got a lot of media attention, and then that went a very negative way for you, and how you're portrayed. And that's why sort of we want to bring you on here and hear from you. How did that all unfold? When the pandemic was announced, or when it came about, what was the first thing that happened in your recollection of that, and how were you aware of this was starting to unfold, and then your views on that?
Right. Well, after I retired from the practice, I went back into politics. I was kind of headhunted by this all-island party, Aintu. Padder Tabine is the leader, and I got elected as a councillor in Derry-Strabane District Council, and there were a fair few votes, which were 39-1. Seriously, I'll never be a politician. I'm not a diplomat. So at the beginning of 2020, I was working in the council, and I was watching very carefully what was going on. I was concerned. It seemed that there was this dreadful illness. This is what we were being told. We had no test. But I remember writing articles right at the very start for the newspapers locally, and they carried them, talking about, they were withering on about case fatalities, but they didn't know they were talking about R numbers. Do you remember the R numbers was all the chat about? You can't have an R number without knowing how many people have actually been infected, and for that, by their parameters, you would have needed a test. So what they were doing was there was no science, no logic to it at all. And also, very early on. I'll tell you, it was at the beginning of, probably about a week before St. Patrick's Day, we had a special meeting of Derry and Strabane District Council about would we cancel the St. Patrick's Day parade. And I was going, lads, I have it sorted. I'm a scientist, I'm a doctor, I've been looking at the stats. There's nothing to worry about. The age profile of this is overwhelmingly among the people with multiple other health problems and, people in very, very elderly people. We don't have to do anything. We can do the St. Patrick's Day parade. I'd been looking at John Ioannidis' stuff. I'd been looking at the data from the Diamond Princess. Lombardy was concerning, but then you looked at other places and there was really essentially nothing happening. So that, and actually if you look back at those stats now in 2020, as I say, there were no tests. So that, and what concerned me dreadfully, no, sorry, at this time I was still in the council, so it was anecdotal, I was telling them that. And then I started to publish stuff in the local press about the harm that lockdowns were doing, particularly to children and to the health service. I could see that. And the minute I started to talk about that, the first thing that happened was the party leader got very nervous saying, "And you can't say those things." And I said, "Hold on a second. You told me that if I joined this party, there were 3 principles, but I could say whatever I wanted outside of that." And it just that whole thing about when you're a member of a party, there's that censorship that goes on. So anyway, I decided I'd go back to help out in the health service because we were being told that the place was under immense strain and that that they needed people. And so
sorry, can I? And I don't like to interrupt.
Sure,
but we're 2020 here.
Yeah.
The first lockdown, and I'm speaking from memory, is this correct? Was it
24th, wasn't it, of February?
Of
March, beg your pardon.
March.
24th of March, yeah.
The initial one was like the following few days after, there was like a soft one on St. Patrick's Day, and then it initially upped. So I'm just so I can get a timeline of this. So in 2020, you were working in politics, but obviously 2019 was the conversation towards the end of the year, towards the start of 2020 was then when the heightened and the hysteria started. Yeah.
Do you remember the videos of the boys from Wuhan all falling flat on their faces and all that stuff, and the rows of ventilators and all this stuff, the fear porn that was, I don't watch TV anyways.
But had you started developing, and this is what I want to clarify, just as we move on, because sometimes we move past these points and we'll not, just so we get the full picture of the story. Had you been getting data and speaking to other medical professionals, or had you been following other, as you said, you followed other people that had this, and had you started forming this opinion with these people in a forum sense of way, or was this based on people you respected and followed and their opinion, or an overwhelming feeling that you've had that you obviously know the human knowledge better than most, and so. Where were you forming this opinion?
At the beginning, I thought I was going crazy because I could see quite clearly that there was no pandemic. And interestingly, this was, in the British system, was downgraded from being a highly consequential infectious disease on, I believe, the 19th of March. And it was after that they did the lockdown. So that, to me, was really bizarre. The other thing is that I was aware that there was the pandemic preparedness guidelines had been reviewed and updated the previous autumn, 2019, and specifically outruled lockdowns, masking, school closures. This was not to be used.
There was pre-planned for pandemics.
And then Agenda 201, which was the Rockefeller Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates, Gavi, these people in a hotel in New York, had this. I was aware of that they had a practice run, and it was very much about the role of the media and messaging and essentially, a psyop to get people to behave in a way that they were saying was conducive to public health. So all of that, I was aware of that. I thought I was going crazy. And then I heard people like Professor Dolores Cahill talking about the viral illnesses. And it was very clear early on. I spoke in Derry, I think it was in June or July of 2020. And for me at that time, it was very clear that this was about injection. This was about the delivery of vaccines to the global population of 7.8 billion people. that was the messaging. We're nobody's safe until we're all safe. You've seen the these composites now all over the world. People were saying the same things. It was like a mantra. Nobody's safe until we're all safe, and we're all going to die unless we do this. And it was absolutely obvious that if you looked at the peak of the disease in April, the peak of what we're called, first of all, they use different parameters to measure death. To me, that was a red flag, because if you have a historical cache of knowledge about how diseases behave, and a new disease comes along, you must use the same tools to measure it. It's absolutely illogical to change the parameters by which you can diagnose or attribute death to that new disease. It's just anti-scientific. To me, that was the most fundamental. I couldn't understand how anybody who called themselves a scientist.
What was the key characteristics that they had changed in handling COVID till previous epidemic or pandemics global? There was, reading now, or am I right and wrong in thinking this? There was, they thought swine flu was going to be like this, and then they thought there was Spanish flu, and didn't it kill 20 million people or something? The Spanish, or was it the Spanish?
God, no.
What one was it? One of them that
I used to know these figures, but I actually just swine flu didn't
not
happen.
Swine, no, not.
We had the health centre full of all these boxes. So we were totally bemused. We were going, what is all this about? And it was all just taken away. There was gowns and masks and all that.
But even
stuff.
I remember in China, and it was 2007 or something, they started wearing masks of worrying about one strain thing. But there was like a plan. Wasn't there like an outline of a plan, as you said? It was changed then to that Agenda 202. But what did they change? How they handled COVID to how that you see that historical illnesses or pandemics,
everything.
So it was not none of it was
everything. They changed everything, even how you diagnose it. Now again, I'm trying to get this in chronological order. Yeah, I wrote to my colleagues in medicine at the time, and I wrote to the chief medical officer and people. I'd been emailing that poor man since certainly since pretty early in 2020, so that you could attribute death to COVID-19 without a test if the person had fever, shortness of breath, or cough. Now, most people in their last days will have some combination of those three things. It was utterly illogical. The other thing that happened at that time, and as I say, I went back to work then in April, May, the end of April, beginning of May, and I could see that the hospitals were emptied, waiting for this influx of people with this alleged pandemic that was coming. And those people were taken from a hospital where they had an expectation of getting care and getting medication and getting treatment, and put to care homes, essentially to die. All expectation of treatment was withdrawn. And in the care homes, and I spoke to care home staff at the time, and it would have broken your heart. These people were there, breathless, maybe in heart failure or whatever. They had no oxygen, they had no pain relief, they had no medical support. The GPs weren't visiting. So therefore, if you had a kidney infection, you just didn't get treated, and something that's eminently treatable was killing people. That was going on. And whenever I went back to work then in the GP out of hours centre, you could see that people just, I'll tell you, one of the very first, it wouldn't be me, the first couple of shifts I did, I was horrified. The first thing was, I think it was maybe the first or second shift, I got a phone call from a woman who had a 14-year-old son she says, he's just not well, he's not himself. And she said, I've phoned the GP a few times, but he hasn't been seen. And I was sort of going, talking, you probably need blood tests done or whatever, and really try and get an appointment. She says, but he's really not himself, he's a bad colour. So I said, right, bring him in. If a mother is worried about particularly a teenager, it's not a small child, that can be a bit over concerned, but teenager, bring him in. So I got a phone call from upstairs saying, you're not allowed to bring people in. What? Excuse me, I'm the clinician here. I'm the person who's taking responsibility for this. no, you're not allowed unless it's an emergency. And I said, well, how could I possibly know if it's an emergency if I don't see the person? So the only thing that they were talking about that you were allowed to see was chest pain and shortness of breath, severe asthma, those things. I said, well, it's an emergency until proven otherwise if a mother's concerned about a 14. And the young fella came in anyway, in a state of near collapse. He was hyperventilating, he was shut down, he was blue, and he had undiagnosed type 1 diabetes. His blood sugar was 30-something. He was red lighted, he resuscitated, had fluids, red lighted to the hospital, spent 3 days in intensive care. Now, I have no doubt that's an unusual story, but that was the sort of thing that was happening. And you know, I'm sure that a lot, we know that 2/3 of the peak of deaths that happened during lockdown were non-COVID deaths. So that that big excess peak, 2/3 of that were because of lockdowns. And I was stating this clearly and publicly, wrote articles, as I say, to the local press, emailed the MLAs, emailed the TDs, wrote to everybody I could think about saying, this is insane. And as I say, I thought I was going crazy, but then I heard people like Dolores Cahill talking about the whole vaccine agenda, talking about these mRNA technologies that they were talking about using and how they had been trialled over the previous decade and came to nothing. I mean, they tried to make respiratory syncytial virus vaccines 10 years previously and the lab rats died. So it's not a good basis upon which to roll out a medication for the whole world. So I was concerned about that. But as I say, and the other, Dave Cullen, who was he's a Dublin-based lad who was doing a lot of stuff about the stats, and Ivor Cummins, who's still at it. Those 3 people saved my sanity, because at this stage I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating. My family thought I was going. I thought I was going crazy because I could see so clearly that this was going to do immense harm, and that there was nothing happening. And it is a fact that across this beautiful planet in the year 2020, in no country was there a statistically significant increase in age-standardised all-cause mortality. There was no pandemic. It didn't happen. Nothing happened, except the artificial spikes in death, which I contend were largely produced by government policy. And it happened all over the world. This is how globalism works, is that the World Health Organization rolled out these diktats, and the media ran with it. We could see, SAGE and iSAGE were top heavy with behavioural psychologists. You have the whole SPY B, you have the whole censorship industrial complex, all of that there was only one message was allowed to be spoken. And in the summer of 2020, even though I was still writing articles and really trying to make myself heard, particularly for the second lockdown, I mean, I did say I would resign from the council if they locked my hometown down again on the basis of PCR tests, because the PCR test then came in pretty early on. Again, I read the science, I read Mike Eden and there was a couple of other professors who critiqued the Corman-Drosten PCR test, and I knew that in populations with low viral loads, with low infection rates, that the PCR test, the positive ones, particularly when they were cycling them between 40 and 45, which Freedom of Information requests that we put in showed, they're non-diagnostic anyway. But if you cycle something at 45, you'll find exactly whatever you're looking for.
Can I slow you down a wee bit, because some of that's going a wee bit over my head, and I want to get a good understanding. I don't want to interrupt you in this, but for some people listening, for myself, a more layman's term of that. First and foremost, I want to ask you, what is the definition of a pandemic? Right.
It's an occurrence of a disease. Interestingly, the definition was changed in 2019, which is a bit peculiar. Generally speaking, a pandemic is understood as something which has massive mortality rates, and that generally speaking, it would be very, very contagious, very spreadable, and generally speaking, it would affect all age groups, not just people who were already ill and very, very old. Don't forget the average age of death from COVID-19, what they call COVID-19, was older than the average rate of death from
because I'm going to ask you more about that. So a pandemic is a global disease that incurs a high mortality rate that doesn't be specific to race, gender, or age, basically, in a rough...
Generally speaking,
Right.
yes. Yeah.
So, in your view, it wasn't a pandemic. This didn't happen.
It's not in my view, mathematically.
But
Nothing happened. Yeah, it wasn't a pandemic by any definition that we have used to describe pandemics
so
to this date.
now that we're going to... You must like being Sean scientist because you moved across like PCR rays and stuff like that.
Sorry.
And it's funny because...
It's the way I tell them.
I know, but this
Yeah.
is why you're here.
Yeah.
Because you're speaking from a medically trained point of view. You're well aware of that. And this is an enlightenment to me because I was not a sheep as everyone was a sheep, but I was a sheep nonetheless. So
To a certain extent, I was at the beginning too, because you're not used to everybody in lockstep telling lies, and there was this footage, and it was concerning at the very start. But once you look behind the curtain, what frightened me then was that, for example, my brother's a professor of geophysics, and he does modelling, and he looked at Neil Ferguson's modelling and said it was rubbish. He said he wouldn't accept it from a first-year student, and yet that was what closed down the world, faulty modelling. And this whole thing actually is...
there's going to be...
They're still using those modelling figures, talking about the lives saved, using models.
Well, I have a question actually, just while we're talking about that. Is this correct? Am I wrong in this? And I'd read this. If you had COVID within 3 months of your death, Sean, and you were knocked down, killed by a car, you would have been statistically recorded as one of on a certain register as a death via COVID.
For most, now my understanding, my memory is it was 28 days
So within a
from
month,
any cause, and then they upped that to 60 days because the figures were kind of dropping off a bit. At one stage, it was 60
if you
days.
were
Yeah, if you got hit
if you
by a
had COVID
bus,
at the start of the month and you recovered and you got hit by a bus, you were a part of the statistic that
Yes.
was
yes,
COVID.
and also if you had
Was it
if you had
registered?
terminal cancer
Some people said it was
and were on
registered.
death's door and coughed or had a fever, that was put down as a COVID death before the tests.
and registered.
And registered, yes, this went on the death certs. And as I say, from freedom of information requests in Northern Ireland and all over the world, when they go back and look where COVID is mentioned on the death cert, for example, if you've pancreatic cancer and abdominal sepsis and COVID, that was put in the COVID stats. But when they actually went back and looked, the numbers of death certs with only COVID were somewhere in the region, and again, this is right all over Europe, 5 to 6%.
So-
But nobody ever told you that on the news, that whoops, we made a mistake here.
If you were gravely ill from another illness, and you obviously, if you my understanding, I'm not a doctor, so my understanding is that cancer itself it's the immune system shutting down, that it's attacking, so that if you got a cold or you got a bleed, you could bleed out, or the cold could be. So the actual reason you died, was the cause of your death was the cancer, the straw. So if you did contract COVID, it more than likely was because you're gravely ill. You would die from it.
Yes.
Now, I want to ask you a few questions about it, because what COVID itself, to you, what would you classify? Because we're aware of people that were gravely ill with COVID.
Well, we were aware of people who were gravely ill,
So
where it was attributed to COVID. The flu vanished that year, pneumonia vanished that year. The things that we have been seeing in the health service every winter since the health service ever existed, all went away. That it was COVID pneumonia. Where,
do you believe then?
We stopped testing for flu, even though to be fair, normally these things were called flu-like illnesses.
I don't
think
about the PCR. If you had the flu, if you had influenza, would the PCR test show positive, and you had the flu but you didn't have COVID? Was this something I had heard that?
Yeah, well, Randox's
you would
own
show-
documents were clear that they couldn't differentiate between adenovirus, rotavirus, and flu. That there was a document which I actually have laminated at home. But the thing about the PCR test is what these tests. This is a big rabbit hole now. The whole virology thing, the whole theory of disease. These things aren't. These are gene sequences. So what they do is they take. In the case of the Corman-Drosten PCR test, they take secretions from, I think, a single patient in China. They sequence that in a computer. They then boil this up with monkey kidney cells and fetal bovine TB and put antibiotics in and culture it. And then they use this mixture to make their assay. And then they put it in a gene bank. So all the variants, these things have never been isolated or seen. COVID-19, the virus, the picture, the wee thing you see with the wee round thing with all the sucker pads out of it. That's only a cartoon. Nobody has seen this thing. This is what they think it might look like. And if you look under an electron microscope at what they call a coronavirus, which is probably just, it's a cell breakdown, there's a round thing with a couple of dots around it, and they're saying, well, this is the virus. Nobody has shown that viruses exist. They've not isolated them and purified them so that all you have in that test tube is the virus. Has never happened. So what? And nor has it been shown that this is the cause of transmission of illness from patient A or subject A to subject B. So the whole thing is actually, it's a theory. And I mean, there's a big podcast on, I think it's this weekend, The End of COVID, when you have a lot of these experts in virology are going to, and I'm really looking forward to it, are going to expose, if you like, some of these theories for what they are. This is not a science. It's actually a religion of a sort. Really and truly, it's stunning. I read Mark Bailey's 60-page paper now, and I don't pretend to understand everything in it, but I get the import. And he argues absolutely that these things seem to be, that nobody has shown that infectious diseases work like that. And then people will go, but your children do get chicken pox, but is there something else causing that?
I need to slow it down, because my mind, it's like listening to, like when you're learning a language,
and
you're picking up some of the words.
We probably don't need to get into it, but virology has not been proven. And the viral cause of transmissible disease has not been proven.
Well, I'm going to ask you a big question.
But the whole science of vaccinology is predicated upon this being true. So it's massive. And that's why this is the one thing that you're really not allowed to say. So you might lose your place when you...
Well, we can't be censored. Bar Scully, don't go down. There's no BS with the BS.
Yeah.
I ain't going to ask...
I'm
going to ask you a big question.
Yeah.
In your view, did COVID exist?
I would tend to believe no. Bad, yeah.
This was a mass hysteria created by a higher power. I want to say a higher power. They obviously have the power to close the world.
It's not just a belief. The evidence would suggest that is the case. Because if you look at all-cause mortality in the year 2020, nothing happened.
How will we be viewed in time? How will people look back?
Well, I
will
think
this be erased from history?
The Nuremberg trials happened after the Second World War, and I think something similar has to happen to the people who did this, to our children especially.
I think this will be erased from history,
So even on that though,
the history books are written by the victors, aren't they? Yeah.
Who is it that created it then? The drug companies? Did they want to create this mass hysteria to start getting people to take a vaccine that they were getting heavily paid for?
Yeah. Well, the answer to that question, Sean, is I don't know. Mm-hmm. We didn't write the playbook. I didn't write the playbook. But what I said in the summer of 2020, the first day I spoke out in the Guildhall Square in Derry, that it looked like the plan seemed to be to create this fear, this mass hysteria, in order to get people to accept a vaccination. And we saw that whenever the vaccine rollout began, where it was, you're going to kill your granny. They told innocent, beautiful children that they couldn't see their grannies or they were going to kill them, and it was just so evil. So it looked that, and I believe that it's becoming more and more clear that this is about getting us a digital ID. This is about getting us away from sovereignty, individuality, personal autonomy, freedom, to getting us onto a digital system. And I think, again, it's very, very clear that the progression of this will be now. And it's talked about. Some of the people, the conspiracy theorists, to be a conspiracy theorist is to be a scientist. You set up a hypothesis and you try and prove it or disprove it. That's what, if we don't have conspiracy theorists, we don't have a functioning society. So I regard it as a compliment. Where was I going with that? Conspiracy.
Well, the reason Sean had asked you the why, the who.
I think
is it money? Is it
it's money?
Control? Is
Sean? It's always money.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think you're. I do. And look, for clarity, I have to say, I was travelling, I was work. I didn't stay locked down. I got bothered, got stopped by the Gardaí, got stopped by the cops because I had only launched my business at the time. And they says to me, was it essential to travel? And I says, if you invested what I invested, it will be essential to you. And the actual Gardaí looked at me and goes, go on your way. But I was travelling to Spain. We were doing work there. And I remember it was scary. Airports were empty. People were in white suits. And I couldn't go to Spain till I got the vaccination.
Yeah.
And me and you had the conversation.
We were both the exact same. So I actually went over and got the vaccine done again, and there was this guy, we'll call it anti-vax. So this guy came over and chatted to me, and I says, look, I get what you're saying. I don't want to take this thing,
sure,
but I'm been forced to take it.
Well, that's coercion, isn't it?
I'm been forced because...
So you did not have free and informed consent?
No, because if I didn't get that vaccination, I wasn't fit to go on a holiday with my kids and my family.
And we were misinformed too.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't have...
You have no idea.
I don't have the education that you have. I don't understand the human anatomy the way that you do, and medication and viruses. So basically, I was found my opinion on, well, I feel fine. I've had it.
I had COVID before that as well. So I had COVID.
Well,
I'd done my test. I did feel unwell. Wasn't great for a few days. Had COVID. Mm-hmm. But I still had to go and take that vaccination. Even though I had COVID and I'm still here now and everything's fine. Like, I know there's a lot of other people who say they had COVID and then the worst happened. They died from it, because that's what they're being told. They had COVID and obviously that happened.
Well, there was complications in that too, in that the COVID protocols were killing people. I've no doubt about that. Midazolam, Matt Hancock, the fact that these respiratory depressants and opiates were being used routinely on people with respiratory illness. The last thing you do to somebody who has a respiratory illness is sedate them. You need to be able to cough and you need to be able to work at breathing. So that was a death cocktail. And again, the thing, I've been suspended from the practice of medicine. So and the reason for that is to say to other doctors, because I've spoken to, I had 3 or 4 hospital consultants here in the north ringing me and going, we can't say this, but would you tell the people? This is from, again, pretty early. I was. And then after a while, I got a bit fed up and says, I'm fed up with you boys making snowballs and leaving me to throw them. It's about time you stood up yourself. But look, I get it. If you have a young family and a mortgage, very clearly, everything that I said from the start of this was true, insofar as I was reading primary science, and I might have made mistakes and said things that were, but generally speaking, the gist of it was done in good faith. And it was done because of what we talked about earlier, my Hippocratic Oath. It's not a choice for a doctor. If you see something which is happening, which is harming people, you're not like somebody who paints houses. You have an obligation to try and help them.
So how did you first come to loggerheads with the medical council? So you obviously took the guild. Yeah.
Well, that happened. I started making videos over the lockdown in my own back room in the house. That first one that I did in the Guildhall Square, it got 1 million views.
Is this of your own fruition? Was this you had these thoughts?
Yeah.
Was there other people that were saying this is what we should do, or was this you?
Yeah.
Just so I can get a clear understanding.
Yeah, there was
were
a huge...
you in a group of ones and you were like, you know what, I've had enough. I'm the one that's going to stand up and I'm going to...
Yeah. No, it was happening all over the world.
But I mean, were you in conversation with someone, or was this just your own idea to do the video? You were like, no, enough's enough, I'm going to speak out. Or had you been conversing with other medically trained people and you're like, you know what, this is what we should say, this is what we should do? Was it you, or was it a political that you'd work with, or was it just you that decided to do this video?
Well, first of all, I had nothing to gain and everything to lose by this. I mean, but this is not an agenda. I'm not anti-vaccine. I have 4 Waynes. They all got all their jabs. I got all my jabs. I ran the baby clinic in our practice for 20 odd years. So but there's a huge difference between the traditional stuff that had been used since I was a baby, and these new technologies, which don't forget, mRNA technology has never been used before in the human species. So I was worried. I was worried about, I've grandchildren, and I was worried about them, the wee ones not getting to school, and so I started talking about the statistics, talking about the fact that the deaths had already started to drop before the lockdown. That and clearly you could see all over the world, whether countries locked down or not, made no difference to the outcomes. The whole mask thing, where it was obvious the carbon dioxide behind your mask is something like 50 times higher than the upper recommended limit, that's healthy. The carbon dioxide in the outside air is 400 parts per million, I think, and behind these masks it's 6,000. And we were putting those in children. We have no idea what that was doing. There was no risk assessment. Again, regarding the jabs, we sent FOIs to every 3-letter organisation we can think of: GMC, MHRA, the Human Medicines Regulation, the European Medical Authority, all of them, like dozens of them. None of them had done a quantitative risk assessment for the various groups. There was no medium to long-term safety data. There was no safety data in pregnant women. There was no experience of using these technologies in children. And yet the global population was being used essentially as a lab rat. They were still in clinical trials. And nobody was being told this. And I'll tell you the worst one. So I'd been making these videos. I did one on PCR tests. I did one on the lockdown. I did one on every aspect of this that I could think of. And I was putting them out about, and they were flying like on social media, because in those very early days, I was the only one with a local accent. I was a Derry girl, and people could identify with you. And I was the only one, certainly that I know of, who was doing this. Now there were other certainly scientists in Ireland. There were a couple of doctors, Marcus de Bruyne, Pat Morrissey, a few others. We did iconoclast round tables in the winter of 2020. Medical people getting together, and Professor Cahill was there at that time too. Just trying to get an alternative viewpoint out. I got barred from Facebook, 90 days. I don't know how many 90-day bans I got. YouTube, gone. You put something up, it just was gone. The censorship was incredible. The newspapers were carrying my stuff at the beginning, and it was, people are fed up listening to you, and I'm going, but I'm the only one who's saying this stuff. I mean, if you can get somebody else to write this, by all means, they can put their name to the stuff that I'm writing, if they agree with it. You could not. I was emailing my medical colleagues. I got no response. And the thing was, I got a couple of people saying, please don't contact me again. But the reason that people don't respond is they don't have plausible deniability. They can, if they respond, it means they've read it. And again, we sent out, I think, about 40 of these notices of liability for harm and death to all the politicians, all the senior movers and shakers. I don't want anything. I wanted them to read and be sure that they knew what they were. Do you know what you're doing? Nobody came back and says, look, I don't agree with this because that's obviously wrong, or nothing. It was just crickets, nothing. They did not want to even talk, because once you look behind the curtain, you can see that this was not science. This was government propaganda and policy, and it was doing real harm on every front. The PCR tests, I would contend, were only there to frighten us. Perfectly healthy people. And the doctors, I spoke to a consultant who had 6 junior staff off, all perfectly healthy because they had tested positive. Now, if you take anything and multiply it by 1 to the power of 45, the number that starts that number, if you go into your thingy and it's 13 trillion times you're multiplying something in a PCR test at those cycle frequencies. And it's generally accepted that anything above 30 is a false positive. You can find anything if you multiply it 13 trillion times. And you know, in maybe slightly more useful in places where people are clinically ill, but in asymptomatic populations, the PCR test had no other purpose than to create the stats that they required to keep the fear going. And again, there are millions. I think the Great Barrington Declaration, there's, I think, 1 million scientists and doctors have signed that now at this stage. But there are tens of thousands of doctors who'd been saying these same things in America and South Africa and all over the world. I happened to be the big mouth locally, but we were feeding off one another and sharing experiences. I worked in the GP COVID assessment centre in Galvin Hospital in one shift. I wasn't meant to be there because I was sort of in Western Urgent Care. There was some sort of administrative error. I didn't know. So I thought I'll book a shift there because I wasn't scared of this at all. And in 4 hours, with about 19 staff, I think I counted 19 staff, there were 3 doctors, 8 or 9 nurses, pile of admins, porters, you know, all that. In 4 hours, we saw 3 patients, none of whom should have been there. They weren't sick. Sorry, there was one woman had worsening heart failure and had to be admitted. That happens. There was somebody who'd bought a SATS monitor off the internet and had the batteries in the wrong way around or something. He thought he was dead and he was fine. Do you know what I mean? Nobody asked him, well, what are you doing with a SATS monitor? You're 30 years of age. And there was a woman who... the man had heart failure and a woman. Seriously.
Wait a minute.
You couldn't make it up.
This boy went and bought an oxygen saturation. And when it didn't show anything, he went, that's an Aiden. I'm dying here. I'm waiting to the doctors.
It would have been comical if it hadn't been so tragedy
something?
because this was in the outpatients of Galvin Area Hospital. That outpatients on an average day would have 300 or 400 people going in there, getting their kidneys seen, getting their rheumatology problems, getting their eye problems sorted, getting their gastroenterology, getting their investigations done, seeing consultants, getting their cancers diagnosed. And instead we had this nonsense. And at the same time, the rock docs, the media docs were outside the same building saying it's like a war zone in there. That was a lie. You know, they knew. They must have known. Either that, you know, the choice here is either that these people are impenetrably stupid or they're lying. Now, I don't care which it is. Neither of those is a good option.
Time's talent. Time's talent and all that. And also, another thing, half the people that go to a hospital don't need to be there. So maybe in that time, when they couldn't go, they weren't going. Like they weren't the ones showing up. They stubbed their toe or something, you know.
Yeah, well, that should be solvable without having to go to these drastic measures. Certainly a good GP, and I'm going to call the practice that we ran a good GP, we probably prevented 20 hospital admissions a week by dint of, if I saw somebody that had a bad asthma, I'd go and assess them, I'd stick them on a nebulizer, I'd bring them back in 2 hours and nebulize them again, I'd give them their steroids, and say, look, if you're not, come back again, review them. And usually the steroids kick in after 6 hours, but a nebulizer, sometimes we give them a lend of a nebulizer from the practice, say, do that too early. If anything changes, get back. If you're not getting better overnight, phone out of, you can manage a lot of stuff. Children rarely need to go near a hospital. Obviously if they've sepsis or something like that, but generally speaking, we can manage them. Children sent to sit for 16 hours in a busy accident and emergency department with drunks and drug addicts and road traffic. It was utterly appalling. There's no place for children.
I done it during it.
Dreadful.
Young cub, temperature.
I know.
Probably just had a temperature, just feeling unwell.
Yeah.
Phone up the GP. Temperature, yep. Oh, you need to go to A&E.
And they were doing PCR tests in the wee pets, putting those things up into their brains.
And the struggle with kids.
Shameful.
Like Emily's now 6 and Jakey's 4. So they're only young kids.
Wee pets.
Didn't want them to rub up their nose and down their throat. Yeah. But exactly that, having to take them till A&E.
Yeah. Well,
down
again,
the road.
all of this is a contract. Nobody had to do or take anything.
And they
But we
literally,
were told that you had to.
they literally checked all the wee stats. Yeah, they're okay. Calpol and Nurofen. That was it.
Yeah.
Had no need to be driving down the road and sitting 6 and 7 hours. Like, it was a disgrace.
As you say that, my wee boy had RSV and he was in and they took him to resus. There was a chest x-ray. He was very wheezy. But now this also leads on to the COVID. He was born on the 11th of March 20, sorry. And they come round the day of his birth and says, have you any family on the way? He says, yeah. Tell them not to. They're not allowed in. The PHA had announced that. It was brilliant because there wasn't tens of families in. I was fit to look after him. Yes, she had an emergency section. So I was feeding the bad, changing him, getting him ready. And it was real nice. There was calm. In the middle of it all, my wee boy, Logan, he had RSV. And I remember we were in resus. They wanted to do a chest x-ray. And I had to hold him, pin him. Jesus, it's a hard thing to do for your baby, you know, to hold him down. You're doing the right thing, but you're holding them for the chest x-ray. And he's sick and he's not right and he's crying. He just wants held and hugged, you know. He doesn't know what he wants, but they come back round. And I mean this. They come back round with another COVID test. And I looked at my wife. I had a fuck enough. I says, you put that anywhere near him. Yeah. And when you hear this young lad, young doctor, built like a brick shit house, would have knocked the dung clean out of me. I goes, you put that near him, I'm going to fucking knock you out. I'm telling you now, swab the wall all you want, but you're not putting that near my baby. I promise you you're not.
Fair play to you. That's called being a good parent.
I was like, he just had been pulled and tortured, but we were tortured with RSV. And I'm going to tell you, I don't have the same. He was born on the 11th of March. They came round on the 19th, or the lockdown was 19th. And then we went home. And like my wife's OCD, house is tile floors, it's all cleaned, it's mopped. Nobody was calling. And what had she left to do? You know, the bar was down, she would have mopped the floor, cleaned about. He was a couple of months in the house without meeting people, different things on your shirt, you holding him, different children running in, or, you know, he hadn't picked up any antibodies. We were coming in and we were paranoid because everything that was going on. You're washing your hands, you're cleaning yourself down, you're changing your t-shirt before you're lifting your bath. Like, the fabric softener is probably the only thing he got. You know, his lungs, they don't want to think, but he's asthma. If he run about his wee lungs, he just didn't. He's getting better now, but I don't think he got the start. I don't think his lungs got the same start because you weren't taking on all these. Like, you need the dust, you need to pick up the stuff, you need to be, you know, chowing on the dirt and picking up pannies and he didn't. And we were tortured. We were back in and out with RSV, bronchiolitis, you name it. I mean, in the first 2 years, what was it like? Temperature's 41. It actually got to the point where, and the thing was, all the symptoms he took every time was everything they would ask. He would take a spike in temperature. Yeah. He would be coughy or he'd be wheezy. And everything would be, he would keep getting swabbed every time, but until I just had the point of where, no, I'm not getting him swabbed, and then I refused, and then every time, tested him, he's tested negative. Did you test him? Tested him, negative. Yeah, I didn't test him. Yeah. I didn't test myself. I actually tell you what I done one time. I was going somewhere and I was worried. Jesus, am I allowed to say this? Probably I'm not. I was hosting the Balmoral show thing. And they were like, we need a knife thing. And I was like, geez, I've invested a lot of money in this. I need to be there. I just rubbed it on something, put it in and sent it off. And I was like, how can they tell? Like, what, you know, there's so many questions we have. And hindsight is always a wonderful thing, you know, question. I'm saying that there, but I followed our things and stupid things, and I'm actually cringing when I think back on it. But that was the reality we were living. We were locked down and we were being monitored and we were being watched. But for you, and then you obviously then decided enough was enough. Went into, was it Guildhall in Derry, and you just the views of that went mental, but that
I
definitely
think
brought you
David
on the
Icke got a hold of it. So it was 1 million views overnight. But what I was saying was completely, it was the truth as I was seeing it. And I was the only work person saying that. I was talking about the way that death was being reattributed. I was talking about the PCR test. I was talking about the fact that people were being left without any expectation of medical help. It would have taken tears from a stone going into and as in the out of hours, going into people's houses, and the first thing they said, even if they had a completely treatable problem, "Doctor, I do not want to go into hospital. I don't want to die on my own. I want to die with my family around me." And it would have broken your heart.
Because they're scared.
Because they were frightened. But not frightened of the Roni pot, but also frightened. They knew that they were going to be isolated, that they weren't going to see anybody, that they weren't going to get the priest or the minister if they were, that they were going to be completely cut off from their people. And I mean, in some of the hospitals, they had laptops, but for older people, that's not the same as. And Sean, we were talking earlier on there about your children and your parents and grandchildren, and you're talking about your wee boy being, immunocompromised almost because of the isolation. I went into the surgery one day, and there was a wee one sitting there, and the parents were there, and in the waiting area, and they were masked up, and I had that part of the mask down around my chin. I'm a magnet. If I see a wee bouncing the wee one was about 8, 9, maybe 10 months old, sitting up and looking about. And I went over and got the beautiful girl. "Oh, look at you." And she looked at me in absolute horror. And she was going, now I'm not any supermodel, but I don't think I would frighten children. And the parents says to me, "This is Anne, you're probably the first adult they've seen without a mask." And I went down to the surgery and I wept. What are we doing to our children? And you've people like Hugh McCarthy, who's a retired headmaster. A lot of the people who are speaking out about this are retired because they're not afraid of the sanctions that come from telling the truth. Hugh's written extensively about the harms to children, about their speech and language development. All of this none of this is controversial. This is now right. There's research right across the world showing the harms done to children's psychological, social, speech and language and educational development. They reckon, that if you lose the year of education, it actually decreases your life expectancy. These children aren't going to do as well academically, and certainly in teenagers and in young people, we saw an explosion of mental health problems, particularly again the marginalised, the disadvantaged, the wee ones that didn't have. It was easy. If you had a lovely detached house and a big garden and a barbecue, the weather was good, you were on full pay, there was no issue. Life was sweet. You were getting paid for doing shag all. It was wonderful. But as I say, if you're living in a block of flats with maybe an abusive partner, maybe with 3 or 4 wains and on a budget, and not allowed to go to the park, they strapped up the swings in the park in the name of God. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
we forget. Yeah. We forget. And it scares me that the World Health Organization now are taking on to themselves incredible powers right across nations to say that if they declare a pandemic, they can do this again. And I wonder how many people the next time will say, "We are not doing this." And it worries me, because I think, again, if they ramp up the fear the way they did the first time. Do you remember the newspaper, look him in the eyes, the boy with the oxygen, tell him all of this. And these vaccines even, we know that they weren't tested for preventing transmission. This whole scenario was nonsense from the start. But the people that suffered the most, I have no doubt, are our children and young people. And they're the people who are going to suffer economically, because you cannot close down an economy for 1.5 years or 2 years and expect that to have a neutral effect, because poverty costs lives. There's a linear correlation between the gross national product, domestic product of a country, and their life expectancy. And if you push people into poverty, if you close down society, I forget the numbers. This was tens of billions of pounds that was handed out in furlough money and handed out for these useless pharmaceutical products. And a lot of that, the PCR, all of that went straight into the pockets of the politicians and the universities and the people, the vested interest behind all of this. And the people who were paying for it were the people who were suffering. You know, it just is, even now, it overwhelms me at times, the injustice of it.
It's the rebalance. There was too many becoming millionaires, there's too many middle class, that a lot of people have that view of that socialist ladder, that the reshuffle of the poor need to be poor again, the richer need to be richer. Yeah. And to keep that
I do think, yes, the elimination of the middle class. You were allowed to go to Tesco's, but you weren't allowed to go to the corner shop. You know, it was all online. The whole push for people to be shopping online, and our town centres were absolutely deserted. There is no doubt that the Western world, I mean, the debt levels, the government have been printing money now for decades. The crash actually happened in 2008, but they just quantitative eased their way out of it and bailed out the banks with ordinary people's money again, because the bankers never lose in any of this. And we sort of have been living in borrowed time in between. Now, there is going to be a massive economic implosion. I have no doubt about that. And you're seeing even now with this, you know, the BRICS nations, you know, these new Brazil and India and China, these new emergent economies, and then the fact that the dollar as the sort of the world currency is declining, and this, I mean, be very sure the billionaires, whatever happens, they'll be fine. But I'm following a boy called James Lindsay. He does a podcast he's really talking about this sort of cultural Marxism and the whole, you know, push towards globalism, which is actually just global communism. And he says, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist. What you do is you read their documents and believe them. If you read the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, you will see that they want to reduce the world's population to 500 million from its current level of, I think, 7.8 billion. It's probably going to peak at about 9 billion. They want population reduction. They want you will own nothing and you will be happy. You know, this World Economic Forum. They want that people won't own anything. They won't own their house. They will rent stuff. You know, that you won't have private property. These people have these documents produced, and we just have to. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's written down. You have to read their documents and believe them, and then see how that fits into the plan of what is going on. And it's chilling. It is absolutely chilling. But I mean, this is kind of moving on to, and I'm not an economist, but you know, you read their documents and you can see COVID is melding now into the climate thing, and you know, this utter nonsense. Our beautiful world is perfectly well looked after. We live in a world that could sustain twice as many people, multiples more people than already live here.
But you're talking about population, they're looking at population. Is it not right that the population already now is in a decline for the first time in like 30 years? Yeah,
not in Africa and India and
China,
places like that. Well, China, their big problem is their demographic problem. They have a population, because they had sex selective abortions. They have a population of wee fat middle-aged men and no women. You know, they're on the edge of a cliff with regards. Italy, I think, is 1.1. You need 2.1 children per couple in order just to maintain your population levels. In most of Europe, that's not happening. You're absolutely right.
On the birth rate, which is what we know is people are dying quicker than people are given that they're having children. So obviously, we have an aging demographic. I mean, people are living longer, and we have a huge disproportion. So we're going to have a you know, and it's beginning to be seen. And I think COVID had a bit to do with this as well. What we have is a hugely dependent older population who are dependent on the health service and on benefits and pensions and all of that, and a dwindling amount of younger people who are able to care for them. So that's not a healthy state of affairs at all. And you can see actually now that in countries, you know, the emerging economies, there are actually incentives to people to have children. There's support for families, you know. And well, China lifted, it used to be that there was one child policy, and then they've lifted it to 2, now it's 3, I think. So
they're actually actively incentivising, but strangely enough, that culture it permeates people, and the population aren't really changing their behaviours that quickly. What we need is loads and loads of babies. We need families. We need in order for society to thrive, you need young people, you need innovation, you need creativity, you need health, we need people, human beings, and the more innovation and creativity there is, the better countries are. You can see, the countries that have come on the best are countries who had, that sort of, if you like, Judeo-Christian civilization where families were respected. And the wider agenda here, you can see it, that the whole sexualization of children, the pushing of agendas which are sterile, which don't produce families. All of that is hugely concerning, and something that I think a lot of people are waking up to.
Do you think there'll be another engineered COVID scenario again in our life? Do you think that they'll try something like this manufactured again?
Oh, the World Health Organization in this they're looking to increase their powers so that they will have global control and they will be able to declare what a pandemic is. Don't forget, as we've said earlier on, it is my contention, proven, statistically and everything else, the COVID was not a pandemic by any stretch of the imagination, but it was treated. It closed the world down, and we're still hearing that if we hadn't done all of that, millions upon millions of people would have died. Based again on these models that they're still using, they're doubling down on this. You can see even the COVID inquiry that's happening in England now. They want people to have lateral flow tests before they go in. This is going to be the biggest whitewash since Widgery. I'm from Derry. Do you know what I mean? It's insane.
Well, we went sideways here, but I want to touch on this because you're obviously now involved in a legal battle yourself. But how did it come to you? You'd made the speech in Guildhall, you'd ruffled a lot of feathers, you got to the point where you're like, right, it's time to tell the truth as you see it and let people know. There's obviously people given the counter of what you say, and they felt like you become dangerous to their agenda or to what they were, as they seen it. Now, I don't want to be sitting here saying, like, I'm completely in agreement with you or I'm completely in agreement with them. I'm sure a lot of these people might have been speaking from what they thought was right. Some of them won't be. Some of them will be incentivized. But where was your first point of friction? Did you get a phone call? Did you get an email? Did you get called in front of a board? Did they say, look, listen, you said here, this is again, blah, blah, blah. How did this all unfold then? How did the confrontation with the medical council and then you obviously ultimately led to your suspension? How did that all come about? Because you were out of medicine at that point.
Yeah.
And then you were back in the ring.
Yeah. I went back to work and as I say, I was glad to do so because I wasn't afraid to try and help people. I'm not doing I'm holier than thou or whatever, but I was happy to get my hands dirty and try and provide. I mean, one of the receptionists said to me, she said, there's more people in the health centre in the days that you're in there than there has been over the previous month. I was happy to see people, happy to look at them. I was seeing people at home.
So you weren't following the guidelines?
I wasn't following the guidelines, no, because they were nonsense, utter nonsense. You could see that.
So it wasn't, they didn't go after you for what it was you
were
saying?
No, it was because I started to speak out. So in the autumn of 2020, just before we could see that these vaccines were coming down the tracks, and we could see that they were actually, even at that time, the JVCI had said they didn't approve them for children, but we could see that the direction of play was going to be that they were going to involve them in children. So I had started, at that stage, I was losing it, and I was making videos, and the General Medical Council and the local GP performers list people got in touch with me. Now, on social media at that time, there were a group of people who had a Facebook page dedicated to getting me suspended or struck off. Dedicated. Okay. I screenshotted all that, sent it to the General Medical Council, sent it to the Trust, sent it to the PSNI, sent it to the Gardaí. It was coming from a virologist down the country. I screenshotted all that. I had evidence of a real conspiracy to have me silenced. Now, look, even if every word I said was nonsense, you're still entitled to say it. And if you're going to have you can't have science. You can't have the science. Science is never settled. And we've heard this thing about settled science. You can't have that. I offered to go on the Stephen Nolan show. I offered to go on the Crawley show. I offered to debate with Robin Swan, with the chief medical officer, with anybody in any forum of their choosing. I wrote fully referenced emails to the General Medical Council, to the Department of Health, to everybody I could think about. I spent weeks, nights sitting writing stuff and reading through all this gear. And the more I read, the more I knew I was right. Because don't forget, there were doctors all over the world saying the same thing, doctors and scientists, but we weren't allowed to be heard. You look at what happened to Simone Gold in America. She did 6 months in jail because of her anti-vax theories.
But why was it your crusade? Why did it
Because I took a Hippocratic oath to protect people, and I could see clearly. I mean, I emailed Dr. McBride, the chief medical officer, and I think it was February 2021, asking him what he was doing to investigate the peak, the significant leap in mortality among old people in nursing homes within weeks of the vaccine rollout. It was there was an absolute signal there that needed investigated.
And had you any feedback from that?
No, they don't even answer. As I say, even freedom of informations, we wrote to all these people about their quantitative risk assessment, doesn't exist. I have all the paperwork. We didn't do it. Michael McBride, I wrote to, as I say, I emailed him about the peak in deaths that we were seeing shortly after the rollout of the jabs. I emailed him about informed consent. I emailed my Medical Defence Society, the General Medical Council, the General Medical Council's policy department, and Michael McBride as the clinician who was rolling these out. Don't forget what I said is true. These vaccines that were given to the citizens of Northern Ireland, including to children and to pregnant women and their unborn babies, were unlicensed products. They were under emergency youth authorisation under the Human Medicines Act 174. This was an emergency legislation. They were unlicensed products and people weren't being told that. Now, in medicine, it's not illegal to give somebody an unlicensed product, but you are required to tell them. And you are also, case law, Montgomery versus Lancashire, I think it was 2015, this is fairly recent, that if you're giving somebody any intervention, first of all, there can't be coercion, and you must give them a one-to-one consent based upon an explanation of tailored to their clinical situation. Now, under the emergency legislation, I think it's 274, dental nurses, chiropodists, non-medical people, and I'm not in any way denigrating these professions, but they cannot give somebody informed consent. So that these things, none of them had informed consent. And what happened then, at that time, I got written to by the health board, and it was sort of, look, what you're doing, we don't agree with it, obviously. We don't like it. We can't really stop you. You're entitled to your opinion. And they said you're not actually giving direct advice to people, which I wasn't. Now, moving on then forward, as I say...
What was this? Sorry, just to
This was a year before the actual suspension.
This is a shot across the bow.
Yes.
In our words, we acknowledge this.
Yes.
But they wouldn't have sent you a letter to say, what you're doing is fine and we're not doing nothing about it. There would have been some implication of a warning in this.
Yeah,
so
it was. We don't like this. We don't think, and you must be very careful how you use social media and all the rest. And fair enough. I knew.
So you knew they had started marking your card, and you knew.
But when I decided to speak
here.
for the first time, I knew where this was going to take me, and I regret none of it. I would do it again. I would do it again tomorrow.
So you did know then, if I speak out here, they're going to come after my medical license.
Yeah,
that's their.
But
play.
this. I mean, if you look at, it was happening across the world.
So then, obviously, then you decided. You got their letter. This is the first port of reference you've had with them. So then you obviously had to make the decision whether you were going to heed it or continue, which you chose to continue.
Yeah.
What was the next step in their campaign towards you then?
Well, I mean, there was low-level particularly on social media. I mean, as I say, there were groups of trolls, and there were newspaper articles written around the time of my suspension, which were just fairy tales. Like it was. But none of that really bothers me. I'd have a good thick skin, you know.
That played all into the hype around that. But what I want to get at is, what was the grounds? Was it that you continued to offer medical practice when their directive was to have
no?
What was the actual medical grounds for suspending you?
Yeah, they were happy enough with me talking about the harms of lockdowns and even masks and PCR tests and stuff like that. But the minute I started using the V word and talking about the harms that these vaccines were causing to people, that's when the guillotine came down. I had done a couple of shifts over a weekend, 21st of August, and I was seeing a significant number of people who had been suffering terribly. And I saw a young patient who had a very, very unusual clinical presentation, which in 40 years of medicine I've never seen, and which we know is associated with the spike protein. These things cause clots. They're not called the clot shots for nothing. So that after that, I was tired. I had been the only doctor because they couldn't get medical cover at this time. It was coming up to the big jab weekend, and there were GAA stadia and football and rugby pitches and all were being used, and they were herding children. So it was from 16 up, and I came home. They couldn't get GPs to work at what GPs are meant to do because they were all working in these places. And I had just done a shift. I'd been the only doctor covering the entire Western Trust, which is Derry Strabane right down to Enniskillen. The only one for a part of one shift. There should have been 10, 12. I'm not sure of what the ratios would be, but there would be 3 or 4 in each centre. And I was completely distraught because I knew that these things were unlicensed. They had not had proper safety data, and that they were being given to people who were of no risk of coming to harm from the alleged disease that they were supposed to prevent. I knew at that stage that they didn't prevent transmission, and that people who had been jagged were actually now, despite what they were telling us on the news, that we could look at the raw data and see that most of the people who were being admitted to hospital with so-called COVID had been jabbed. And even at that early stage, you could see the beginnings of an increase in all-cause mortality, which hadn't been there during 2020. So I was freaking because these are children, these are innocent, these are young families, these are
young guy that's presented with what you believe was vaccine related.
Yeah.
How can you be definite of that?
You can't. But my point is that if you don't report everything that happens, you will not see signal. We were assured that the MHRA had been set up in order so that every side effect would be reported and managed, or reported and monitored, and that they would be looking at that. None of that happened.
There is a thing about reactions to drugs, medications, and vaccines. There's like a website or something, or like is this correct? Or Blue? Or
usually 1 or 2 deaths would be enough to pull the thing and have a full evaluation. Now, at the time I made that video, there were 1,600 deaths attributed to the vaccines. You can't prove cause and effect, but with that sort of a signal, you cannot proceed.
But then I'm going to, because I'm playing devil's advocate, so I really want to ask this. But you're saying if 1 or 2 deaths on 10,000 dosages is enough to pull something, but this is millions of dosages. Yeah. The percentage might not change, but it's enough, obviously. And I'm only saying that, playing devil's advocate in the numbers here. Mm-hmm. So per person, per administration, like that wouldn't be more than some other drug. Do you know what I'm saying?
No. This was orders of magnitude higher. No. This has never been seen before for any medical product. I mean, there was a signal all over the countries.
Where do we
the
get
Israeli
that from?
data was probably the first data that was in, and we could see in Israel that first of all the positivity of the PCR and the so-called infections were getting worse, and that these were not preventing transmission. Asymptomatic, I mean, there was a study in Wuhan right back in 2020 showing they looked at 10 million people. The Chinese don't prick about when it comes to doing medical studies. 10 million people, no asymptomatic transmission, So the thing was that none of these
wary of Chinese data, full stop.
possibly.
Because they make anything up. They maybe
You
never
could be
done
right.
it.
Well, I tell you, I would be very aware of any data because we now know that most of these medical journals are completely captured. The Lancet published a paper on ivermectin and was forced to take it down again because it was fraudulent. So that all of it. And if you listen to people like Asim Malhotra, who's a renowned cardiologist, he talks about, that the most of these so-called peer-reviewed papers are based upon data which is
what is
suspect,
the
to put it mildly.
What is the procedure? This guy presented himself with symptoms that you believe was vaccine related, and
Well, he'd already seen a hospital consultant who told him. Sorry, it was actually a woman. It was a female. She'd already seen a hospital consultant who told her that whatever it was, it definitely wasn't the vaccine. So I actually wrote to that hospital consultant and says, if you don't fill in these yellow cards, we cannot see signal. We are required.
That's what I'm going to
morally.
Did you then
and legally to report?
So then, did they presented for a second opinion, or
it was a complication arising out
okay.
of it?
So then,
over a weekend,
you're duty bound if this happens to fill out this form. If it's on your opinion that this is what it was, I take it you'd be duty bound to go to a senior or your senior, or is there a protocol in place? Yeah.
Well,
was this ignored?
My contention is that, first of all, as a busy doctor, each yellow card report takes about 20 minutes to fill in. They're unbelievably complex and difficult and just ridiculous. Now, if they were serious about post-marketing surveillance, they should have had a dedicated person in each accident and emergency department and in each health centre designated to handle those things. It didn't happen. Most doctors tried to do a couple of them, just gave up. And a lot of people, don't forget that this was a very lucrative time for people who were engaged in this stuff. So, and there is bias there in that you don't want to see something, you're not going to see it. And, and we knew at this time we were writing to the MHRA going, have you got a quantitative risk assessment? What are you doing? And I mean, it wasn't me. There was thousands of people saying, what are you doing about this data? We have 1,500 deaths which are attributed in your system to being vaccine related.
Okay. So
what are you doing to find out? How are you showing that they're not vaccine related? And they couldn't answer because they weren't looking.
But then what was the next step then with the medical council? So what was the next step then?
What happened was I made that video on the Saturday night of the 21st of August. And
But you were aware then?
There was a protocol published the previous day on the 20th of August, which I have obtained a copy of. And actually one of the MLAs put in a freedom of information and got independent verification that this was actually used. So on the 20th of August, there was a protocol published and signed off by Michael McBride and the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer and the Chief Nursing Officer, advocating for this BN2 162B2, the unlicensed product, to be given for the big jab weekend. And they were pushing this for, before the schools reopened, and it was sort of to keep, so that children don't suffer harm to their education. There was no reason for the schools ever to be closed in the first place. But even allowing for that, so that this was going on. So McBride signed off this protocol, our Chief Medical Officer, on the 20th. I told people it was unlicensed on the 21st. The initiating email of the complaint against me, and this is now the subject of a High Court case, the initiating email came from Dr. Michael McBride at 11:15 on the Saturday night. I think I have it here. Again, heavily redacted, but the GMC refused to divulge this information to me, but we got it from the Department of Health.
So this was the complaint that was submitted about you? Okay.
This was written to the head of GP services in the Western Trust, to Dr. Jane Kennedy, who is the General Medical Council's head in the North.
Do you not have a chance to respond to the complaint that's made again, No. So they redact most of it?
No. I still haven't had disclosure from the General Medical Council, and I said that the way that they've behaved is fraudulent because they didn't even give full disclosure to the interim orders tribunal who adjudicated, if you like, on my case. But I'll go back to this, so that this was the head of GP services, the head of the General Medical Council in the North, another GMC employee who's their employment liaison officer, and there were several other people copied into this, but these names were all redacted. Margaret, this social media clip has been shared with me by a concerned doctor. And this is 11:15 at night. May I ask if this practitioner, that is me, is on the Health and Social Care Board performers list? If so, I would wish that this is reviewed. Now, don't forget, this is the chief cook and bottle washer talking to essentially somebody well down the food chain. I have very serious and significant concerns in respect of this disinformation, that lovely word, being promulgated by a member of the medical profession, which are, in my view, not consistent with the standards and responsibilities of us as doctors, as outlined within good medical practice. Now, good medical practice talks about the requirement to keep people safe, first do no harm, and about informed consent, and about our obligations. If you see something wrong, you don't have a choice, you have to say. So that then set off, as you may imagine, a whole... So I went into work on...
You're not aware of who sent this?
It came from Dr. Michael McBride.
It came to you redacted, but you're not aware of who originally wrote that?
Under Freedom of Information, we've obtained an unredacted copy of that, but not from the...
Right, so you're now fully aware of who said that and what position they're in.
Yeah.
And what
so that actually was a group of doctors, if you like, joining together to sanction me.
Okay.
Every word I said was true. But unfortunately, it grieves me greatly to say this.
Were they... So then what is the procedure? Michael McBride is the head of the General Medical Council. So at the...
No, he is the Chief Medical Officer in the Department of Health. The licensing authority for this, and again, these people told us the licensing authority was the MHRA. No, the licensing authority was the Secretary of State for Health in England and the Minister for Health here, Robin Swan. So I would venture that a lot fewer people would have, if people had known Robin Swan was the licensing authority, they might have been slightly less willing to roll their sleeves up. Do you know what I mean? So that he was the person, and Michael McBride was the clinician who gave clinical approval.
What
for these
was
protocols.
Their response then? So they've sent you what they've received.
I went into work on Monday at 6:00 to be told that it was over. I know that they had taken me off the performers list, so I couldn't work. And it was funny, because the media knew before I knew. Oh, the other people who were copied into this were people from the media, the Irish News and the Belfast Telegraph were on this within hours. Yeah.
So this here had been copied, and
they weren't on that initial one,
right?
But certainly in subsequent emails, you can see that they were actually pushing. The media were pushing. What are you going to do about this? We need to sort this.
I want to be very clear on the procedure of what happened. So this email was sent to you at 11:00 on a Saturday night. This was a group of...
No, it wasn't sent to me. This was... I had no idea any of this was happening.
Oh, right.
But
so
I knew that whenever I made a video talking about vaccine injuries and telling people that these products were not licensed, the proverbial was going to hit the fan.
So this is clear now. So you knew there would be repercussions. You weren't aware of this. You weren't aware of this happening in the background. This had been constructed by a group of doctors and sent, and then it had been peddled to the media that was then aware when Monday morning came round. And you were bound to have known.
They had a Zoom call with.
Was there an emergency meeting made
at 10:00 on the Monday morning? Yeah.
So
and the decision was made at that Zoom meeting
to remove. Who has the power to remove you from the performers list?
That would be Margaret O'Brien, and it actually was delegated to a doctor. These are all General Medical Council doctors called Dr. Moya McAlevey, who was given.
So they deemed what you said was misinformation.
Yes.
And that is not in keeping with the good practice of doctor. And that means that you don't meet their standards to be on the performers list.
Yes.
You must be on the performers list to serve your medical duties in the hospital. Is that correct?
Yes.
So then they temporarily, because they can't make that definite decision, they would have suspended you pending review, I take it?
Yes.
So they suspended you. You arrived in on the Monday. You were
do a shift, yeah.
To do a shift. You were then made aware, and you may have had an inkling that something to this level would happen.
I had no idea it would be quite so
severe,
quite so quick.
Right?
Yeah, it was.
And also, the media was also
in there, yeah.
And
particularly Shannine Graham from the Irish News and the girl Cochrane, is it Amy Cochrane from the Belfast Telegraph, were actually writing to the Department of Health, going, what's happening.
Were
what's
they
happening.
looking
Can you
to-
give us a statement by 4:00? You know, they wanted their headline news for Monday afternoon. Yeah.
Did they want your version, or did they want?
Nobody to this day from the media has asked me what happened. Present company accepted. You know, I've done loads of alternative media things, but no.
But and look, listen, I'm sorry to be so panicky.
No, you have to get. you have to get this right.
There's going to be a lot of people that say this, that, and the other. When these come out, we've seen this. Me and Sean have seen this. You. This is your podcast, and this is your version of events. But I want to be very clear on the actual factual version of events. So they had. How did they inform you that you're suspended? Would one of your superiors have met you there? Would you have received an email, or would you have been given a letter, or did somebody just say to you, "Hey, we got a phone call there. You're not here"? You'd have had to have some sort of formal
it was kind
initiation.
of that last one. You know, the supervisor in Western Care needs to talk to you. And from memory, it was a phone call. Yeah,
So
that I'd been removed from the performers list. So.
And then, do you get a chance to appeal that? Do you get a representative? Have you? Is there a union?
This is the interesting thing that there is a process. Now, we have shown that from the beginning, the General Medical Council did not act with good faith. That the information they gave the Interim Order Tribunal was deficient. And then, so that there's a review. Well, first of all, regarding the trust and the General Medical, I gave them a 48 page, I think, fully referenced document laying out the evidence for why there was no requirement to give these products to anybody, and the potential dangers that this was going to cause. And as I say, I'd been emailing these same people with information about this now for almost a year at this stage. And so, but you go then to the Dr. Michael Levy prepared a document which she then gave to the General Medical Council. Again, essentially hearsay evidence. This is misinformation, but she didn't say what it was.
Hearsay if it's your video.
Well, she did say, she said that in that letter, she says that I had said these things were unlicensed when in fact they are fully licensed. That was incorrect, factually incorrect. The BN2162B2 product was never licensed.
Is that
Comirnaty, which is supposed to be biological the same, but which the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer of England, is it Keith?
But is this semantics?
No, it's not. No. This is vital. The licensed product Comirnaty was not being deployed in the vaccination centres in this country.
But
it wasn't available at that time because they had got 40 million doses from Pfizer to be rolled out over 21 and 22. The last of those only went out of date, again, from a Freedom of Information, in February 2022. Comirnaty, and again, there's stuff here about the protocol. On the 1st of January, Northern Ireland was the European.
Yeah.
It wasn't. After that, it was just UK. No, sorry, Great Britain. You know, they had their own thing, but here the only licensed product was Comirnaty. That wasn't used. As far as we can't find out when the first doses were given, but certainly over that summer. And when I was making the video, the product which was being put into people's arms was an unlicensed product. That is provable by their own documents.
So that's the
thing they'd wanted to shut me up.
You had disclosed it was unlicensed.
Yes.
And I don't want to come like I'm antagonising you, because I think people need a very clear, and what I'm saying is
at the end of a very long line. It's okay.
No, but I don't, I appreciate you
joking.
coming on and enlightening me, because I'm learning. But what I'm saying to you is, they're obviously saying that's semantics, that they believe that's a licensed product because it's identical to this, but you're saying it's not.
No, the Chief Pharmaceutical Officer in England, it's Keith Ridge, you call him. His letters is OB or something like that. He says they are legally distinct. They're separate products. They should be kept separately. They're legally, they're
So
different.
No matter
they're
the
not
vaccine,
the same, and they're not
the
interchangeable.
same vaccine.
Beg your pardon?
So the vaccine, like that's the Mosan or whatever, the Mosana or whatever, the different vaccines you could have had, Pfizer, you could have, there was different.
AstraZeneca were the two used. AstraZeneca was only used for a month or two, and it very quietly fell off the radar. They just stopped using it. They didn't really make a big fun and green about it because it was causing astronomical problems with blood clotting events.
But what I'm saying is,
all of this
there were
is
different products. Wasn't all the one same biological path? Like this was mass reproduced, but everything was identical. Do you know what I mean?
But we don't know, because did you see the is it Mr. Roos in the European Parliament? No, Pfizer have refused to issue the ingredients that are in these. I think there was 13 pages of just black redacted stuff.
But how can a government pay billions of pounds for something they don't know what it is?
Well, that's a very good question. You'd need to ask the government that.
So, well, anyway, we're
do you know what I mean? The thing is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. No safety test, no medium or long-term safety data. The trials that they did, if you read those, you can see the primary end point was whether or not you got a positive PCR test. If you look at the original Pfizer trials, you will see that in the control group and in the vaccinated group, there was a higher all-cause mortality. They weren't getting COVID; they were dying at a higher rate of other things. So the initial trials also, there were whistleblowers showing that these were fraudulent, that they were unblinded. There were no control groups. After 6 months, they jagged them all. So there was no long-term control group.
But before we go there,
these trials would not. They're unfit for purpose.
But before we go there, and the level of the trials and the vaccine, I wanted to know the steps of what had happened to why. So they had obviously, the misinformation they had said was that it was a licensed product. Mm-hmm. You had told the public that it was not, because what I wanted to know was, you can't suspend someone with a freedom of speech. They must have homed in on a very clear, what they felt was a very clear breach, as in it was licensed in their mind. In yours, you had said it wasn't.
But their paper said it wasn't.
But what I'm saying,
their own documents showed that it wasn't.
But that was their point, where they could then invoke the suspension of your license. So this is what they used to.
Well, they also said that I had said that these products were harmful, and that I might be given advice which would bring the profession into disrepute, and that I might cause harm to people. Yeah, but
open word. So they had to close in on one or two things, because you're obviously,
and that I would be in some way harming their vaccination process,
because less people will take it because they believe a doctor.
Yes.
And
the one good thing for babies, and funny, the Cabinet Office have a file on me, the British Cabinet Office, and it's they have this whole information thing. But the one tweet that they pulled me up for was, I think it was the BBC had said the North of Ireland has the lowest uptake in children and young people in Europe, 1.1% or something. And I tweeted that and said, parents are making their own risk assessments and given informed consent. And that's the one thing they didn't want me to say. I'm delighted. Because we did leaflet outside of schools. Again, the leaflet was using NISRA stats. This was not a conspiracy. It was talking about the actual statistics and the risks to children and young people.
When you got suspended, was that to you either you were going to fight your suspension, you had retired, and you were becoming disillusioned with the NHS anyway, because you were working in an environment where you didn't believe they were doing right for the people anyway. So to me, it would have been, you wanted to continue to help people, but so that had happened, you were suspended, but you had such a long, distinguished medical career. Was this to you, you want to make your stand again, that you don't want them attacking, your career, or to you was this, what? F you, I'm gonna unleash the truth here and just go nuclear. And because I'm getting the thing when you're saying your leaflets, you're talking, you're now tweeting more, you're like, right, you know what, you suspend me, you've tried to silence me, you're not silencing me.
I was the guy from the beginning. Really, this was, and even my family are saying, Mammy, you need to stop. I mean, all encompassing, because these things are doing harm. The birth rates have dropped, the infertility rates, we know that these spike proteins concentrate in the testes and ovaries and the liver. That these things don't stay in your arm. This is the biggest pharmaceutical disaster ever to have happened to the human race. And I think that's provable. For example, I have here a paper. Now, again, Excess deaths among children aged 0 to 14 across Europe. This is Euromomo statistics.
I have to be clear here, Anne. Now, these are not statistics we have checked or we're aware of. So just these are stuff that you brought with you.
Yes. No, Euromomo shows that in the 0 to 14 age group, in I think it's 46 European countries, they looked at the data, the excess deaths in children in that age group has increased by 63,000%. Now, that doesn't mean 63,000 deaths. The actual number is probably a few thousand, but it's hugely significant. Children 0 to 14 don't die. And in fact, if you look at 2020, the numbers of deaths in that age group went way down because at that age group, very, very rarely they get cancer. Sometimes they get bad, in fact, asthma or stuff like that. Generally speaking, it's accidents, car accidents, cycling, drowning, those types of things. That went right down in 2020. It's up now catastrophically and nobody is even looking at it. Now, none of this gives me any pleasure to say. I wish to God every word I had said was untrue and wrong. I really wish it.
Some people, and this is the problem with statistics, I'm not aware of Euromomo or who that is, or some people might have said, well, there was nobody taking statistics in 2020 because everyone was working on COVID and they were working on this and we didn't have as many people in the hospital.
Yeah, well, in 2020, if a person died of COVID, it was in every news bulletin. Now, if somebody dies from a suspected injury, they're not even allowed to speak. Andrew Bridgen, talking about vaccine injuries, spoke to a parliament which was empty. That our democracy, these people cannot even hear this because then they will be aware.
They're complicit.
They're complicit.
And they've signed off on this. And they allowed the country to be closed down. They allowed the economy to be closed down. Yes. They are now in a position where we are in recession.
Yes,
we're staring down the barrel of a gun.
All of this was predictable.
There's untold mountain debts. There's billions of pounds to be paid to the farmer. They're obviously paid to lobby on behalf of sugar companies, pharmaceutical companies, whatever company that needs something lobbied at that point. But the worrying thing about statistics, and you, this is the thing, you can take statistics now and you can show like 63,000%. I just, that's to me.
Yeah, that is a kind of, I think, a melodramatic figure, yes, but it's mathematically correct. There's a startling increase.
To that point. But that's what I'm saying. I'm just worried.
In Great Britain, there is a 20% increase in all-cause mortality. Nobody even wants to talk about it. We have a Prime Minister that in any sane society, people will be going, well, let's find out what's going on. And the one thing I wrote, I actually got a rapid response published in the British Medical Journal last week because my name was mentioned in a paper that was there.
You had an article?
I had an article published.
And they will still, I don't mean this to be... The medical council's move to taint your reputation in a way that...
This is the British Medical Journal, sorry.
Right, okay.
This is not the General Medical Council. It's the British Medical Journal published.
They're now publishing on behalf...
No, they do.
Okay.
To be fair, their deputy editor right from the start of this was...
They must be independent till...
I wouldn't... That's complicated, but none of these medical publications are independent. But the thing that I had published was saying, let's sort out this thing about conspiracy theories. Let's sort out, are people like me and people who are saying what I'm saying completely insane, or are we telling the truth? And it's so simple. The Office for National Statistics, the Northern Ireland Statistics and Research Agency, and all of those data crunching people paid by public money quite simply need to look at all-cause mortality as a function of vaccination status. It's over. Immediately, it'll become clear. Either I am crazy, or there's nothing to see, or there is a correlation. That is the one parameter that they will not measure disease and mortality against. And in fact, in most cases where a pattern was beginning to be shown, they've stopped publishing the vaccination status of people who have come to harm. Now, that to me is hugely concerning. Do you know?
The problem is with this, you could go and you could rehash and you could go and it'll get too complicated for people. But
all I'm saying is that if it's very easy to sort out.
Time's going to tell it because
it already is.
I get that.
But these things are still being pushed. These things are still being given. They're now licensed down to 6-month-old babies.
Do you think
I can sleep? Do you think I can be quiet?
Well, I'm going to
knowing what I know.
How
could I not?
You've taken this such a personal crusade at But I would say
because the people who are being tasked and paid to do it won't do it.
But no. But what I'm going to say to you
So
is,
this is.
it,
I don't want to do this. I thought I'd be knitting at this stage. I'm a granny.
Is that a personal toll? But is that a personal toll?
No, because nothing matters in my life except this. And this sounds like I don't want to sound like Joan of Arc, but I will go to jail.
Toll.
I will go to jail for this.
But that to me, that's a personal toll, because things, and I don't mean this as a grandmother, and at that stage of life when you've worked with your community for so many years, your life shouldn't be consumed by that. It should be consumed by going on holiday, spending time with your grandchildren. There is a personal toll to you.
Well, none of us are going to be doing that. If this agenda is allowed to progress forward, we're going to own nothing and be happy, and we'll be in stacked and packed in cities and 15-minute cities and low emission zones and all this. So
I'll ask you this.
This is our civilization is being dismantled here. I said that in court the other day. Our civilization, the law, truth, honesty, the regulatory bodies, the things that are supposed to keep us safe, the things that we pay for to keep us safe, are being systematically destroyed by powers beyond our control. The governments even aren't in charge. You look at the difference between Labour and Tory. These are just they're two wings of the one bird.
But if they stopped and they says, "We're sorry, we're wrong," would that
as long as this trajectory stops, that's important. I don't think there are already people who understand that what I'm saying is to some extent true.
So many people, and me and Sean
people
have
are
had the
waking up.
conversation.
I mean,
we've questioned so much, and I may have come across in this that I'm not, but I don't want somebody saying, well, they didn't ask any of the hard questions, or that it weren't, trying to play devil's advocate.
But you have to. I want to be challenged, because even now, there's days I say, have I got this right?
But isn't that always the question of insanity? If you're the only sane person, does that make you insane? Because if everyone else has a different view and you're the only one with sanity, does that make you the... But I'm going to ask you this. Where are they with you now? You're in
okay,
court
so
now.
we're in court.
Yeah.
We are saying
You've
that...
appealed that suspension.
Yes. They want to extend my suspension. I've already been suspended for 18 months. They want to extend it by a further year. Now, I have no intentions of going back to work. But
you're not buying out on that?
My problem is that if I can get justice in the courts, and I have no doubt that what we're saying is correct, we can show that every word I said was true. Unfortunately, the real world evidence now shows that everything I said was. And I'm not saying, and look, two of my 4 children have been injected. I don't want this to be true. I pray every day for them. Not everybody's going to come to harm. A lot of these things may have been placebo. We know from the work of Headley Reese that a lot of them might have, but the supply chains, the cold chains, and that weren't good. Not everybody's going to come to harm. But this will happen again. They're talking about mRNA technology now for flu vaccines and for childhood vaccinations and all of that.
Well, if you win your court case, would that be a precedent where they?
If I win my court case, I think there will be 100,000 doctors saying what I'm saying within a week. That's what I think, because I'm telling the truth. And now they see it.
It needs to be licensed.
I've had thousands of people. No, sorry, not thousands. I've had hundreds. Is probably not an exaggeration, of people contacting me privately and more publicly, saying we're seeing the same thing, but I have a mortgage. I mean, the fact that doctors and scientists and statisticians cannot be heard, to me, is again that's fundamental to our civilization and our way of free speech and the entitlement to be able to argue your case in the public square. You see what's happening in the 26 counties now with hate speech and all that.
I think we could go...
You could go forever.
I think, and we really could, and we could go off down side roads, and we have went off down side roads, and I'm going to say this. When people have personal agendas on things, I always worry about if people speak out about things, what personally motivates them. From talking to you, I don't see a personal motivation to do this. I see a motivation for governments to cover things. I see a motivation for pharmaceutical companies. I don't see the personal motivation for you to be speaking out at the loss that you've received. So that's where I would say that when when I say I appreciate you coming on and I appreciate you giving us the time. I really do, because I don't see normally what happens, and if people think, and I have my preconceived ideas for people coming on. Is this woman mad? Is this, well, we're going to have a conversation here. The one thing, the overwhelming thing that I seen here for me was your only motivational factor was you were caring for children, you were caring for people. I didn't see it as you're glory hunting for media, or you're pushing something or selling something. So to me, already, that would make me want to listen to what you had to say, because you didn't have a motivation behind it.
I'm still trying to get this message out to people by every means at my disposal. I'm censored online. The media don't want to talk to me.
I think people have
this is for the people listening.
It's
not for me.
They're sick of COVID now, and they've made the decision. I made the bad decisions. We're getting it, and you're going to have to live with. We're going to have to live with what the fallout of that is. But look, and I, on behalf of me and Sean, I definitely thank you very much. It's been informative. What do you think, Sean? There's a lot there.
I knew there was going to be so much around it. Do you know what I mean? I knew there was going to be so much information around COVID, and like
it's huge. It's hugely complex.
You talk about these things.
Just before we talk, you were saying about broadening out and going at this. I actually do believe that this COVID thing is part of an overarching narrative, and I do, unfortunately, as I say, read their documents and believe them. The United Nations agenda for 2020. If you talk about a lot of the people who are sceptical about COVID have moved on to look at the whole climate thing and the whole population thing. It's all nonsense, but it's all pointing the one way. They want to disempower people. They want global control. They want to know what we're doing, what we're spending. This is not about health. This is about global power and global communism. We will own nothing. And anytime communism was tried, hundreds of millions of people died. It doesn't work. It's not going to work this time either. So we need to fight it.
On that bombshell, we're out. Thank you.